I'd give everything I own for one kiss, the mountain man told the widow. Snow drifts down on a hard Colorado town where a rugged mountain man, scarred by loss and silence, blurts out a vow that shakes the church walls. He'd give everything for one kiss. The widow, shunned and whispered against, shocks the crowd when she steps forward and answers him with her lips. But this kiss is no simple spark. It binds them in a storm of danger. The law twists against them. A railroad agent lurks in the shadows. Fires rise in the night, and a single trunk of papers could bring an empire crashing down. He is a man sworn to solitude. She is a woman carrying secrets heavy enough to break a town apart. Together, they stand at the edge of ruin, or redemption. When truth sets the streets ablaze and bullets fly beneath the church bell's toll, will love be their salvation or their undoing? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late autumn wind whistled through Clearwater's empty streets as Daniel McCrae stood rooted outside the white-painted church, his worn boots planted firmly in the dirt. His own words echoed in his mind, shocking him more with each passing moment. I'd give everything I own for one kiss from her. The declaration hung in the crisp mountain air like morning frost. His weathered hand touched the spot on his cheek where Nancy Hensley's lips had pressed so gently. The warmth of that kiss lingered, despite the chill that made his breath visible in small clouds. Behind him, the church door creaked open and closed as the congregation filed out, their whispers carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon. Did you see that brazen display? A widow, acting so forward. That mountain man, speaking out of turn. Daniel's shoulders tensed at their words. He'd spent years alone in the high country, where a man's worth was measured by his actions, not idle gossip. The town's judgment felt as harsh as a winter storm. His eyes fixed on the livery stable down the street, its rough-hewn boards offering the promise of escape. His horse waited there, ready to carry him back to the familiar solitude of his cabin. The crunch of boots on gravel made him turn. Sheriff Tom Bailey approached, his tin star catching the wan sunlight. Quite a scene you caused in there, McCrae. Daniel squared his shoulders. Wasn't aiming to cause trouble, Sheriff. Maybe not, but trouble seems to find its way around that widow woman. The lawman's eyes narrowed. Railroad business leaves long shadows. Reckon a woman shouldn't have to carry her husband's burdens, Daniel said, his voice low but firm. The words surprised him again. This wasn't his fight, wasn't his place to speak up. Yet something about Nancy's quiet dignity in the face of the town's scorn had struck a chord deep within him. The sheriff adjusted his gun belt. Just watch yourself, McCrae. Town's got enough complications without adding more. Daniel watched the lawman walk away, then turned toward the livery. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. The familiar scents of hay and horse leather greeted him as he entered the dim stable. His bay mare nickered softly in recognition. As he began checking her hooves, a habit born of years in treacherous mountain terrain, Daniel's mind wandered back to Nancy's face in that charged moment. He'd seen something in her eyes before she stepped forward, not just courage, but a flash of understanding that matched his own loneliness. "Mr. McCrae!" The soft voice startled him. He straightened to find Nancy Hensley standing in the stable doorway, her dark dress and shawl silhouetted against the afternoon light. She stepped inside, her movements careful but determined. "Ma'am," he managed, suddenly aware of his rough appearance. The buckskin jacket worn smooth at the elbows, the beard he trimmed only when it interfered with shooting. "I wanted to thank you," she said, moving closer, "for speaking up. Not many do." Daniel ran a hand along his mare's flank, grateful for the familiar texture of the horse's coat. "Wasn't right, how they were treating you." "The truth is complicated," Nancy said, her hands clasped tightly before her. "My husband. There were dealings with the railroad that weren't honest, but I didn't know. Not until after he passed." Daniel nodded slowly. "A person ought to be judged by their own actions." "Yes." She smiled slightly, the expression warming her eyes. "Like standing up in church to defend a stranger." He felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "About what I said. I apologize if I embarrassed you, ma'am." "Nancy," she corrected gently, "and you didn't embarrass me. You surprised me. And yourself, too, I think." Daniel's laugh was rough but genuine. "Been up in the mountains so long, I reckon I've forgotten how to mind my tongue in proper company." "Sometimes the truth needs to be spoken plainly." Nancy's gaze met his steadily. "Even if it comes as a surprise to everyone, including the person speaking it." The air between them seemed to grow thick with unspoken words. Daniel found himself noticing details he'd missed in church, the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry, the way she held herself straight despite the weight of the town's judgment. A clatter of hooves outside broke the moment. Nancy glanced toward the door, then back to Daniel. "I should go. Sunday dinner at the boarding house won't wait." "Of course." Daniel shifted, uncertain of the proper words for such a moment. "I'm much obliged, ma'am, Nancy, for understanding." She paused at the stable door, sunlight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. "Will you be heading back to your cabin soon?" "Meant to," he admitted. "Got supplies to stock before the heavy snows come." Nancy nodded, something like disappointment flickering across her face. "Then I wish you safe travels, Mr. McCrae." "Daniel," he said quickly, surprising himself again. "My name's Daniel." Her smile returned, small but genuine. "Safe travels, Daniel." After she left, Daniel stood for a long moment in the quiet stable, his hand still resting on his mare's warm flank. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in the wooden walls, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. His carefully ordered world, the simplicity of mountain seasons, the familiar routine of checking trap lines and tracking game, seemed to shift beneath his feet like spring ice breaking up on a river. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. Now he found himself tangled in something that both terrified and called to him, like the first time he'd scaled a dangerous peak just to see the view from the top. The memory of Nancy's kiss burned gentle as a banked fire on his cheek, promising warmth against the coming winter's chill. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song through Clearwater's streets, carrying the first few snowflakes of the season. They drifted past the stable door like tiny white feathers, a reminder that the high country would soon be locked in winter's grip. Daniel watched them fall, knowing his planned departure should happen soon, yet feeling the pull of something stronger than habit or survival. His mare nudged his shoulder, as if sensing his uncertainty. Daniel patted her neck absently, his mind still full of quiet words spoken in a dim stable, of courage shown in a sunlit church, of the way Nancy's eyes had met his without flinching from what she saw there. The town's whispers would grow louder now, he knew. The mountain man and the railroad widow, their brief exchange in church would feed gossip through the long winter months ahead. Daniel had always preferred the honest howl of wind through pine trees to the murmur of human voices. But for the first time in years, the thought of his solitary cabin brought no comfort. He began saddling his horse with practiced movements, each familiar task a counterpoint to the unfamiliar emotions stirring in his chest. The leather creaked beneath his hands, the sound mixing with the soft patter of snow against the stable roof. Winter was coming to the mountains, but something else was dawning in Clearwater. Something that made Daniel McCrae, for the first time in years, question whether solitude was truly the safer path. Dawn spread its pale fingers across Clearwater's main street, touching frost-rimmed window panes and weathered wooden signs. Nancy Hensley stood at the wash basin in her small rented room, the water's chill helping to clear away lingering dreams. Mrs. Turner's boarding house creaked and settled around her, the familiar sounds of the widowed schoolmarm preparing breakfast drifting up from below. The looking glass above the basin reflected Nancy's careful movements as she pinned her hair. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Sleep had been elusive, filled with memories of Daniel McCrae's unexpected defense and the warmth of his rough voice in the livery stable. But such thoughts wouldn't put food on the table or keep a roof over her head. Nancy smoothed her dark skirts and descended to help with morning chores. Mrs. Turner nodded a quiet greeting as Nancy began setting out plates and cups for the other boarders. "Quite a scene at church yesterday," Mrs. Turner said, her tone carefully neutral as she stirred a pot of porridge. "Yes." Nancy kept her movements steady, though her cheeks warmed at the memory. "Mr. McCrae was very kind. Mountain men usually keep to themselves." Mrs. Turner sprinkled salt into the porridge. "Surprised everyone, him speaking up like that." Nancy said nothing, focusing on laying out spoons with precise movements. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its beam. Outside, the town was coming to life, wagon wheels creaking, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Later, as Nancy walked to fetch water from the pump, she noticed Mrs. Whitaker grab her young daughter's hand and cross to the other side of the muddy street. The girl looked back curiously, but her mother hurried her along. Nancy's shoulders stiffened, but she kept her head high. The weight of the town's judgment was a familiar burden now. In the saloon, Daniel sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee cooling before him. He'd meant to leave at first light, but something held him in town. The coffee was bitter, nothing like the pine needle tea he brewed in his cabin, but it gave his hands something to do besides fidget. "Say, McCrae!" A weather-beaten miner dropped onto the bench across from him. "That was some declaration you made yesterday." Daniel grunted, hoping his lack of response would discourage further conversation. But more miners drifted over, their faces bright with curiosity. "You really sweet on the railroad, widow?" another asked, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Thought you preferred bear cubs to people." "Ain't sweet on anyone," Daniel muttered, though the memory of Nancy's quiet dignity in the stable made his words ring hollow. "Just don't hold with folk being treated unfair." "Fair?" The first miner leaned forward. "Nothing fair about what that railroad did to honest claims." Daniel pushed back from the table, the legs scraping against rough planks. "Her husband's dead. Whatever he did, she's carrying enough burden without your help." He stalked out of the saloon, leaving his coffee untouched. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the frost, but a chill wind still cut through his buckskin jacket. Daniel paused on the boardwalk, running a hand through his beard. The truth was, Nancy's kindness had struck deeper than he cared to admit. The gentle press of her lips to his cheek had awakened something he'd thought long buried in mountain snow. Evening settled over Clearwater like a worn quilt, shadows pooling between buildings as Nancy made her way to the mercantile. The store's bell chimed as she entered, and Mr. Peterson nodded curtly from behind the counter. She was examining spools of thread when the bell rang again. "Mrs. Hensley?" The voice was smooth as creek stones. "Might I have a word?" Nancy turned to find a stranger in a bowler hat, watching her with calculating eyes. His suit was too fine for Clearwater, his shoes too shiny for the dusty streets. "I represent certain railroad interests," he said, moving closer. "I understand your late husband left some documentation behind." Nancy's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, mister." "Blake. James Blake." His smile never reached his eyes. "Come now, Mrs. Hensley. Surely Thomas discussed his work with you. The land contracts, the special arrangements." "My husband kept his business affairs private," Nancy said, edging towards the door. "If you'll excuse me, I have duties waiting." Blake's hand shot out, catching her arm. Those papers could be quite valuable to the right parties. His grip tightened. Or quite dangerous to the wrong ones. Nancy pulled free, her voice sharp as winter wind. "Good evening, Mr. Blake." She hurried back through darkening streets, her steps quick but measured. Would not run, would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. But as soon as she reached her room, Nancy locked the door and pressed her back against it, breathing hard. The small trunk beneath her bed held more than mementos of her marriage. Thomas had pressed the papers into her hands on his deathbed, his fever-bright eyes desperate. "Keep them safe," he'd whispered. "Make it right." Nancy knelt beside the bed, pulling out the trunk. The lock was secure, but how long would that matter if Blake decided to press harder? She touched the worn leather, remembering Thomas's last words. He'd tried to confess something about the railroad's dealings, but death had stolen his voice before he could explain fully. Daniel stood in the shadows across from Mrs. Turner's boarding house, his years of hunting making him one with the darkness. He'd seen Blake following Nancy from the mercantile, noted the man's predatory stance and Nancy's rigid spine as she walked away. Now Blake lounged against a hitching post, smoking a cigar as he watched Nancy's window where lamplight glowed behind curtains. Something protective stirred in Daniel's chest. Foreign, but powerful. He'd spent years avoiding other people's troubles, focusing on survival in the high country, where a man's only worries were weather and wildlife. But Nancy's quiet strength called to something deeper than survival. The lamp in Nancy's window went dark. Blake finished his cigar, grinding it beneath his heel before moving off into the night. Daniel remained in the shadows, watching, though he barely understood his own reasons. The wind carried the scent of coming snow, reminding him his cabin needed attention before winter set in fully. But as he stood guard in the darkness, Daniel knew his carefully ordered world had shifted. Nancy Hensley carried secrets that drew dangerous men like wolves to wounded prey. And despite all his habits of solitude, Daniel McCrae found himself choosing to stay, a mountain man standing sentinel in the valley, watching over a widow who'd shown him simple kindness when he least expected it. The night deepened around him, stars wheeling overhead as Clearwater settled into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but for now, Daniel kept his vigil, a silent guardian in the shadows, while Nancy's window remained dark and still. Morning sunlight painted Clearwater's main street golden, the fresh snow from days prior already trampled to brown slush. Daniel adjusted his borrowed string tie for the 100th time, feeling like a dressed-up bear as he waited outside Mrs. Turner's boarding house. He'd traded a prime beaver pelt for a proper shirt at the mercantile, though it pulled tight across his shoulders. The door creaked open, and Nancy stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple blue dress, her honey-brown hair swept back neatly. Something in Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. "Mrs. Hensley?" he said, doffing his hat. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the church social this afternoon." Nancy's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. McCrae, that's very kind, but—" She glanced down the street where several townsfolk had stopped to stare. "People are already talking after Sunday service. I wouldn't want to cause you more trouble." "Ain't troubled by talk," Daniel said firmly. "Never much cared what folks think of me up in the mountains. Don't see why I should start now." A small smile touched Nancy's lips. "You're very direct, aren't you?" "Only way I know to be, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, Mr. McCrae. I would be honored to accept your escort." The church basement was decorated with paper chains and evergreen boughs, tables laden with pies and preserves. Conversations hushed as Daniel and Nancy entered, then resumed in urgent whispers. Daniel guided Nancy through the crowd with a gentle hand at her elbow, hyper-aware of every eye upon them. "Well, well," Deputy Marshal Hayes's voice cut through the murmur. He stood near the punch bowl, thumb hooked in his gun belt. Quite a sight. The mountain hermit and the railroad widow. Daniel felt Nancy stiffen beside him, but kept his voice level. Evening, Deputy. Hayes sauntered closer, his badge gleaming. Tell me, Mrs. Hensley, how's a respectable widow come to keep company with a wild man from the hills, unless there's truth to rumors about your particular charms? Blood rushed to Daniel's ears. That's enough. Or maybe, Hayes continued, his smile sharp as a knife, you two have other business together? Railroad business, perhaps. Nancy's face had gone pale. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between her and the deputy. You're speaking to a lady, Hayes. Mind your manners. That a threat, McCrae? Hayes's hand drifted to his pistol. Because threatening an officer of the law is a serious matter. No threat. Daniel's voice was quiet, but carried in the suddenly silent room. Just reminding you of common decency. Decency? Hayes barked a laugh. That's rich, coming from a mountain savage defending a swindler's widow. He raised his voice to address the crowd. Folks, we've got a clear case of disorderly conduct here. Can't have rough characters disturbing the peace at a church gathering. Two ranch hands who served as part-time deputies materialized beside Hayes. Daniel could have fought them, had wrestled mountain lions and won, but not here, not with Nancy watching and children present. He allowed them to grab his arms. This is ridiculous, Nancy protested. He's done nothing wrong. Ma'am, Hayes touched the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. I suggest you mind your own business unless you'd like to join him. Daniel caught Nancy's eye as they dragged him toward the stairs. Don't worry about me, he called. I've slept in worse places than jail. The cell door clanged shut with finality. Hayes tossed Daniel's confiscated belt onto his desk and lit a cheroot. Comfortable, McCrae? Hope so, because you'll be cooling your heels until I decide otherwise. After Hayes left, darkness crept into the jail's single room. Daniel sat on the narrow cot, remembering Nancy's face as they'd hauled him away, shock and shame warring with something softer, something that made his chest ache more than his wounded pride. Why had he done it? He'd spent years avoiding trouble, building a life of solitude where other people's problems couldn't touch him. Yet here he sat, locked up for defending a woman he barely knew. But when Hayes had started in on her, something primitive had risen in Daniel's gut, the same instinct that made him face down wolves threatening his livestock. The moon rose, casting silver bars across the cell floor through the barred window. Daniel traced them with his eyes, remembering the quiet strength in Nancy's voice when she'd protested his arrest. There was more to her story than the town knew. He was certain of it. The railroad agent's threats, Hayes's pointed questions about business, it all circled around whatever papers she kept locked away. In her small room at Mrs. Turner's, Nancy knelt beside her bed. The lamp cast warm light across her clasped hands as she prayed, tears threatening behind her closed eyes. Lord, give me guidance, she whispered. Show me the right path. The trunk beneath her bed seemed to pulse with silent urgency. Thomas's last gift, or last burden, lay within. Contracts, letters, ledgers that proved how the railroad had cheated honest folks out of their land. Evidence that could bring justice, or destroy what little peace she'd found in Clearwater. She'd seen the hatred in Hayes's eyes at the social, the barely contained violence. If she brought the truth to light, what would men like him do? And now poor Daniel sat in jail for simply showing her kindness. He didn't deserve that, she murmured. Such a good man, Lord. Simple and honest as sunlight. The memory of Daniel standing tall before Hayes, dignity unruffled even as they arrested him, brought fresh tears. She'd never meant to draw anyone else into her troubles. But there was something about Daniel McCrae that made her feel safe for the first time since Thomas died. Something solid as mountain stone and just as dependable. Nancy opened her eyes, gazing at the lamp's steady flame. Two paths stretched before her. Bury the papers forever and let the past fade away, or stand up for truth no matter the cost. Either way, she couldn't let Daniel suffer for her sake. "Show me how to make this right," she prayed. "Give me courage to do what must be done." Back in the jail, Daniel shifted on the hard cot. A coyote called somewhere in the hills, reminding him of his cabin. He should be there now, smoking meat for winter, patching the roof. Instead, he lay here questioning every choice that had let him down from his mountain sanctuary. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Nancy's face in the church basement, tired but unbowed, carrying her burdens with quiet grace. Something about her called to the lonely places in his soul, making him yearn for things he'd thought long buried. Iron bars couldn't cage that feeling. Daniel McCrae had spent his life learning the wisdom of solitude, but now he wondered if true courage meant letting someone else's troubles become your own. The night deepened. In her lamp-lit room, Nancy prayed for guidance. In his darkened cell, Daniel watched moonlight inch across the floor, and between them secrets and danger gathered like storm clouds over the mountains. The morning sun cast long shadows through the jail's barred windows when Nancy's soft footsteps approached. Daniel rose from the cot, smoothing his wrinkled shirt as best he could. She appeared at the iron bars, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle that released wisps of steam into the cool air. "Good morning, Mr. McCrae," she said quietly. "I brought you something to eat." "Much obliged, Mrs. Hensley." Daniel stepped closer to the bars. "Though you shouldn't trouble yourself on my account." "It's no trouble." She unwrapped warm biscuits, passing them carefully through the bars. "And please call me Nancy." "After yesterday, I reckon we're past formalities." Daniel accepted the food, the cloth still warm against his calloused hands. "Then I'm Daniel to you." They stood in comfortable silence while Daniel ate. The biscuits were light and buttery, reminding him of ones his mother used to make. When he finished, he cleared his throat. "Best meal I've had in years. Up in the mountains, cooking's more about staying alive than pleasure." "You live alone up there?" Nancy asked, her voice gentle. Daniel leaned against the bars, looking past her to the window. "Wasn't always alone. Had family once, parents, younger sister, built a good life, raising sheep and hunting. Then came the winter of 1872. He paused, the old pain rising. "Fever took them all within a week. Nothing I could do but dig frozen ground and pray." Nancy's hand reached through the bars to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." After that, couldn't bear to be around people much. Moved higher up, started trapping, figured solitude was safer than risking more loss. He met her eyes. "But loneliness, it gnaws at a person. Makes you wonder if God's forgotten you exist." "I understand more than you might think," Nancy said softly. She glanced around the empty jail, then moved closer to the bars. "I came west seeking a fresh start after my parents died. Met Thomas, my late husband, and thought I'd found belonging. He worked for the railroad, seemed so passionate about bringing progress to these territories." Daniel watched her face as she continued, seeing the struggle between loyalty and truth. "But the railroad, they weren't honest with people. Thomas got caught up in it. Land deals that weren't right, promises broken." Her voice dropped lower. "When he died, I inherited not just his name, but all the suspicion that came with it. Folks look at me and see corruption wearing a widow's weeds." "That ain't fair," Daniel said firmly. "You're not responsible for his choices." "Perhaps not. But I understand feeling forgotten by God." She offered a sad smile. "Though lately, I'm starting to wonder if he works in ways we don't expect." Their eyes met through the bars, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest, like spring thaw breaking winter's grip. Here was someone else who knew what it meant to carry silence like a heavy coat, to wake up wondering if today might be the day grace found you again. Reckon he does at that, Daniel said softly. They talked more easily then, sharing simple things, favorite hymns, memories of childhood prayers, the way mountain mornings made your heart lift despite yourself. When Nancy finally had to leave, the cell felt colder for her absence. As evening approached, Daniel heard more footsteps, different from Nancy's light tread. Reverend Cole appeared, his kind face concerned as he approached Nancy's boarding house. Daniel watched through the window as the preacher knocked at her door. Nancy welcomed Reverend Cole into her small sitting room, offering him tea in a chipped cup. The preacher's weathered hands curled around the warm ceramic as he studied her face. "My dear," he said gently, "I've come to offer what support I can. Yesterday's events troubled me deeply." "You're very kind, Reverend." Nancy smoothed her skirt nervously. "But I don't wish to cause discord in your congregation." "The Lord's house should be a refuge for all who seek him," Reverend Cole said firmly. "I've watched you these past weeks. Your quiet dignity, your kindness to the children. Whatever others may say, I believe your heart is good." Tears pricked Nancy's eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right, keeping silent about certain things, trying to protect what little peace I've found here." "Trust God's timing, child," the preacher patted her hand. "He doesn't waste our struggles. When the moment comes to speak truth, you'll know it, and you won't face it alone." After Reverend Cole left, Nancy sat by her window, watching darkness settle over the town. From the direction of the jail, a soft sound carried on the evening air, Daniel's deep voice humming an old hymn she recognized from childhood. The familiar melody wrapped around her like a warm shawl. In his cell, Daniel didn't know his quiet song drifted out into the cold street. He simply let the tune rise from some deep place inside where hope had begun to stir again. The same hymn his mother used to sing while kneading bread, his sister harmonizing as she mended by the fire. For the first time in years, the memory brought more comfort than pain. The lamp's flame flickered lower, casting dancing shadows on the wall. But Daniel kept humming, his voice a thread of warmth in the gathering dark. Through the bars, stars began to appear, the same stars that watched over his mountain cabin, over Nancy's window, over all the lonely souls who waited for morning's grace. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. But tonight, something had shifted between two wounded hearts. Trust, like a fragile seedling, had broken through hard ground. And in that tender beginning lay the possibility of healing neither had dared to hope for. The hymn faded into silence. Daniel settled onto his cot, remembering Nancy's gentle eyes, her quiet strength. Sometimes, he reflected, God's mercy came disguised as loss, driving you down from your mountain until you found the very thing you didn't know you needed. Morning light crept across Clearwater's dusty main street as townsfolk gathered in small clusters, voices low but urgent. Outside the general store, 3 miners huddled over steaming coffee cups, their faces creased with worry as they watched Reverend Cole make his way down the boardwalk. The preacher stopped to speak with each group, his gentle voice carrying just far enough to plant seeds of truth. "Brothers and sisters," he would say, shaking his head sadly, "perhaps we've been too quick to judge. What if evidence exists that could clear up these land disputes?" At the mining camp, where rough-hewn men gathered for breakfast, the Reverend's words found particularly fertile ground. Tom Bennett, a grizzled claim holder who'd lost his best sight to the railroad, scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Reckon if the widows got papers," he muttered to his companions, "might explain why them railroad men been sniffing round her place like coyotes at a henhouse." Deputy Hayes watched these conversations from the shadows of the jail porch, his jaw tightening. When the railroad agent approached, Hayes grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. "You need to move faster," the deputy hissed. "Cole's stirring up trouble and folks are starting to listen." The agent adjusted his bowler hat, eyes cold. "We'll handle it. Just keep McCrae locked up until—" "Can't." Hayes spat into the dirt. "Cole's already arranged for him to help with the Watson barn raising this afternoon. Got the judge to agree. Says it's Christian charity." Inside the church office, Nancy sat across from Reverend Cole, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a worn leather portfolio on his desk. "These were Thomas's," she said softly. "He left them the night before the accident. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep them safe." The preacher carefully opened the portfolio, revealing stack after stack of documents, land deeds, letters, and contracts that told a damning story of corruption. His weathered face grew grave as he read. "My dear," he said finally, looking up at Nancy, "these prove the railroad never had proper claim to half the lands they seized. The signatures were forged, the surveys falsified." Nancy twisted her handkerchief. "I've been afraid to show anyone. But seeing how they treated Daniel yesterday." "You were right to bring these to me." Reverend Cole closed the portfolio with reverent care. "These need to be presented publicly. The sooner the better. There's safety in bringing truth to light." By early afternoon, the whole town had gathered at the Watson property, where timber and tools lay ready for the barn raising. Daniel arrived under escort, blinking in the bright sun. His eyes found Nancy immediately, and a quiet smile lifted the corners of his mouth. The work began in earnest. Daniel's strength and experience quickly proved valuable as he helped direct the raising of the heavy support beams. His voice rang out clear and steady, calling the timing as men heaved together. "Ready now. Lift. Hold steady." Nancy moved through the crowd with her water bucket and dipper, making sure everyone stayed hydrated under the warm afternoon sun. Each time she passed near Daniel, their eyes would meet briefly, speaking volumes in silence. Children darted between the workers' legs, alternately helping and hindering. Little Sally Watson, only 6 years old, tugged at Nancy's skirt. "Miss Nancy, will you teach us a song? Mama says you know lots of hymns." Nancy's face softened. Setting down her bucket, she gathered the children in the shade of a half-finished wall. "How about All Things Bright and Beautiful? Can anyone help me start?" Soon their sweet voices rose above the pounding of hammers. Daniel paused in his sawing to listen, a gentle chuckle escaping as Nancy taught the children the hand motions to go with the chorus. The sound of their laughter seemed to lift everyone's spirits, and the work moved faster. Even some of Nancy's harshest critics found themselves softening as they watched her patient kindness with the children. Mrs. Peterson, who had been particularly cold, grudgingly admitted to her friend that the widow does have a way with little ones. The afternoon wore on, and the barn began taking shape against the blue Colorado sky. Daniel worked tirelessly, his shirt soaked with honest sweat. When Nancy brought him water, he drank deeply, then said quietly, "You've got a gift with them youngsters." "Children don't carry grudges," she replied softly. "They see with clearer eyes than most grown folks." "Reckon that's true enough." He handed back the dipper, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you, Nancy." Not just for the water. She understood what he meant. Gratitude for her visiting him in jail, for treating him like a man rather than a curiosity. "You're welcome, Daniel." Truly. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, the last boards were nailed in place. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the new barn. Women laid out a potluck supper on long tables, while children chased fireflies in the growing dusk. Nancy stood a little apart from the crowd, watching the scene with quiet wonder. The barn glowed like a beacon in the gathering darkness, its fresh-cut timber still fragrant in the evening air. All around, people who had shunned her just days ago were now smiling, sharing food, celebrating their shared accomplishment. Reverend Cole appeared at her side, his kind eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "See how the Lord works?" he said softly. "Sometimes it takes everyone putting their hands to the same task to remember we're all his children." Nancy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Hope, That tender seedling she had almost forgotten was unfurling in her heart. For the first time since arriving in Clearwater, she felt the possibility of belonging. Daniel watched her from across the yard, his heart warming at the sight of her gentle smile. Even under guard, required to return to his cell once the celebration ended, he felt strangely free. Something was changing in Clearwater. He could feel it in the air, see it in the way people moved and spoke more easily around Nancy. The new barn stood straight and true against the darkening sky, its lanterns glowing like stars brought down to earth. It was more than just a building. It was proof of what could happen when people chose to work together, to see past their prejudices, to the truth waiting to be discovered. The stars hung like diamond dust above Clearwater as Daniel and Nancy made their way down the lamplit street. Their footsteps echoed softly against the wooden boardwalk, matching the steady rhythm of their hearts. The evening air carried a hint of pine from the surrounding mountains, mixed with the lingering scent of supper fires from nearby homes. Daniel walked close beside Nancy, his tall frame casting a protective shadow. The successful barn raising had lifted everyone's spirits, but now, in the quiet of night, tension crept back into their shoulders. Every darkened doorway seemed to hold secrets. Every whisper of wind carried potential threats. "Reckon that was fine work today," Daniel said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Never seen children take to someone quite like they did to you." Nancy smiled, though her eyes remained watchful. Children have an honest way about them. No pretense, no judgment. Sometimes I think they understand more than we give them credit for. They paused at the corner where Main Street met Cedar, the boarding house just ahead. Light spilled from its windows, warm and welcoming, yet Nancy found herself slowing her steps, reluctant to end their walk. Daniel cleared his throat, his usual confidence faltering. "Miss Nancy, there's something I've been meaning to say." He stopped, turning to face her in the pool of lamplight. His weathered face showed traces of vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Back in the mountains," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "I used to sit outside my cabin of an evening, watching the sunset paint the peaks. Always thought something was missing." He looked down at his hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work. "Used to dream, you see. Dream of a wife beside me, children's laughter echoing off them canyon walls." Nancy's breath caught in her throat as Daniel's words stirred something deep within her. "But after losing my kin that bitter winter," he went on, "I buried them dreams deep. Figured some men weren't meant for family life." He met her eyes then, and the longing there made her heart ache. "Until that day in church, when my fool mouth ran ahead of my good sense." Nancy felt her cheeks warm at the memory. "You certainly caused quite a stir," she said softly. "I'd never been so embarrassed in all my days." She paused, gathering her courage. "Yet, if I'm being honest, those words of yours, they gave me strength. When everyone else saw only Thomas's widow, you saw me." Daniel stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the night air. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. But before either could speak again, a familiar voice cut through the darkness like a knife. "Well, ain't this touching?" The railroad agent emerged from the shadows, his bowler hat tipped at an arrogant angle. His patent leather shoes gleamed dully in the lamplight as he approached, each step deliberate and threatening. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "I trust you've given some thought to our previous conversation? About keeping your nose out of matters that don't concern you?" Nancy lifted her chin, though Daniel could feel her trembling slightly beside him. "My husband's good name concerns me, sir. As does justice for this town." The agent's face hardened. "Let me be plain, madam. You'd do well to remember your place. Widows who meddle in men's business often find themselves regretting such interference." His hand brushed back his coat, revealing the gleam of a pistol grip. Daniel's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his body tensing like a mountain cat ready to spring. The agent's eyes flickered to the movement, his smirk widening. "Daniel, no." Nancy's touch on his arm was light but firm. Her fingers pressed gently against his sleeve, urging restraint. He's not worth the trouble it would bring. The agent laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the buildings. "Listen to the lady, Mountain Man. Wouldn't want to find yourself back in that cell, would you?" He adjusted his hat with exaggerated care. "Good evening to you both. Do remember what I said, Mrs. Hensley?" They watched as he melted back into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the night. Only when the sound had completely disappeared did Nancy release her grip on Daniel's arm. "I don't like leaving you here alone," Daniel said, his voice tight with frustration. "That snake means business." They covered the remaining distance to the boarding house door, both acutely aware of eyes that might be watching from the shadows. The porch light cast weak yellow circles on the worn boards beneath their feet. "I'll be fine," Nancy assured him, though her voice wavered slightly. "Mrs. Taylor keeps a shotgun by her bed, and the doors have good locks." She tried to smile, but worry lined her face. "You've done more than enough already, risking yourself on my account." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Ain't about risk, it's about what's right." He looked down at her, his eyes intense. "Promise me you'll bolt your door tight tonight, and if you hear anything suspicious, I'll raise the alarm," she finished for him. "I promise." They shared one last look, heavy with things unsaid, before Nancy slipped inside the boarding house. The door closed with a solid thunk, and Daniel listened for the sound of the bolt sliding home before he finally turned away. The walk back to the stable, where he was meant to return to custody, seemed longer than usual. Every shadow held potential threats. Every rustle of wind through the streets made him think of Nancy, alone in her room. His thoughts churned like storm clouds as he settled onto his borrowed cot. Meanwhile, in her small room, Nancy sat beside her lamp, its light barely holding back the darkness. The trunk containing Thomas's papers sat before her, its presence both a burden and a duty she couldn't ignore. Her fingers traced the leather binding of the documents inside, each page heavy with truth that could change everything, or destroy what little peace she'd found in Clearwater. She thought of Daniel, his quiet strength and unexpected tenderness, the way he'd stepped forward to defend her, not once but twice now, the dreams he'd shared of a family he'd thought forever lost to him. Her heart ached with a familiar loneliness, but also with something new, something that felt dangerously like hope. The lamp flickered as she finally prepared for bed, casting strange shadows on the wall. Though she'd assured Daniel of her safety, her hands shook slightly as she checked the lock 3 times before finally lying down. In the stable, Daniel stared at the rough-hewn beams above his head, sleep eluding him. The agent's threats echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Nancy's smile as she taught the children their hymns. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't stand guard over her every moment. The thought ate at him like winter frost, leaving him restless and uneasy as the night grew deeper. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, watching over them both as they lay awake, separated by darkness and circumstance, yet bound together by growing feelings neither had expected to find in this small mountain town. The morning dawned gray and heavy with clouds that sagged low over Clearwater's peaked roofs. By mid-morning, fat snowflakes began drifting down, first sparse and tentative, then thick and steady. The sound of their falling muffled the usual bustle of the town, creating a hushed blanket over everything. Inside the schoolmarm's boarding house, Nancy stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she worked on preparing supper. The warm scents of baking bread and simmering stew filled the cozy space. Through the frost-edged window, she could see Daniel outside, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically as he swung the axe. Each blow sent chips of wood flying into the deepening snow. Mrs. Taylor, the schoolmarm, bustled about nearby, stirring the pot of stew. "That mountain man of yours sure knows his way around a woodpile," she remarked, a hint of approval in her voice. "We'll be grateful for his work once this storm settles in proper." Nancy felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her eyes on her task. "He's not mine, Mrs. Taylor. He's just kind." The older woman's knowing smile went unseen as she moved to check the bread in the oven. Outside, the steady thunk of Daniel's axe continued, a comforting rhythm against the growing whisper of the snow. As afternoon crept toward evening, more townspeople began appearing at the boarding house door, shaking off snow and stamping boots. The kitchen grew warm with bodies and conversation. Nancy noticed how the talk kept circling back to one topic: the railroad's plans for Clearwater. "Heard it straight from Jenkins over at the telegraph office," one miner was saying, warming his hands by the stove. "Railroad's pushing through whether we like it or not. Don't care about proper claims or deeds neither." "They can't just take what's rightfully ours," another protested, but his voice held more worry than conviction. Nancy's hands trembled slightly as she served bowls of stew, knowing the truth that lay hidden in her trunk upstairs. Daniel had come in from his wood chopping, and she could feel his eyes following her movements, watchful and protective. The peaceful evening shattered with the bang of the front door flying open. Deputy Hayes stood in the entrance, snow swirling around his feet, his face flushed with more than just cold. The conversations died instantly. "Mrs. Hensley," his voice cut through the silence. "I believe you have some property that needs surrendering." He advanced into the room, boots leaving wet marks on the clean floor. "Those deeds your husband left behind, they belong to the railroad company." Nancy straightened her spine, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Those papers belong to me, Deputy. And they'll prove what the railroad's been doing to honest folks in this town." Hayes's face darkened. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and seized her arm, fingers digging in painfully. "This isn't a request, woman. You'll hand them over now or—" The deputy's threat cut off in a grunt as Daniel surged forward, breaking Hayes's grip on Nancy and shoving him backward. "Take your hands off her," Daniel growled, positioning himself between Nancy and the lawman. Hayes stumbled, but caught himself, his hand dropping to his gun. "That's assault on an officer, McCrae," he snarled. "You just bought yourself more trouble than you can handle." Everything happened in a blur after that. More men burst through the door, Hayes's deputies. Daniel managed to land one solid punch before they overwhelmed him, 3 against 1. Nancy cried out as they slammed him face first into the wall, blood streaming from his nose. "Daniel McCrae, you're under arrest for assaulting an officer of the law," Hayes announced, straightening his vest with exaggerated dignity. "Take him back to the jail, and make sure he understands the seriousness of his crime." The deputies dragged Daniel out into the swirling snow, leaving Nancy trembling in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. The other townspeople avoided her eyes, slowly gathering their things and filtering out into the storm, leaving half-empty bowls of stew cooling on the tables. Mrs. Taylor touched Nancy's shoulder gently. "Come now, dear. Let's get you upstairs before that devil thinks to come back." Nancy nodded numbly, allowing herself to be led to her room. But as soon as the door closed behind her, purpose replaced her shock. She moved quickly to her trunk, fingers shaking as she lifted out the stack of damning documents her husband had left behind. A child's Bible lay on her bedside table. Little Sarah's, one of the orphans she watched during the day. The girl had forgotten it after their reading lesson that morning. Nancy ran her fingers over its worn leather cover, remembering how Sarah had said it was her most precious possession. "Lord, forgive me for this," she whispered, carefully separating the Bible's cover from its backing. With delicate movements, she slipped the deeds inside, then pressed the covering back in place. Unless someone knew to look there, the papers would be safe. She placed the Bible back on the table, then sank onto her bed. Through her window, she could see the snow falling harder now, the flakes catching the light from the street lamps. Somewhere in that storm, Daniel was being led to a jail cell, bleeding because he'd stood up for her. Nancy knelt beside her bed, clasping her hands tightly. "Please," she prayed, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "Please keep those papers safe and watch over Daniel. Give me the strength to do what's right, no matter what comes." The snow continued to fall outside her window, each flake a silent witness to her prayer. In the distance, a church bell tolled the evening hour, its sound muffled by the storm that had settled over Clearwater like a thick white blanket, hiding secrets both dark and hopeful beneath its surface. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds that hung over Clearwater. Fresh snow from the previous night's storm lay pristine and untouched across the town, but the peaceful scene was about to shatter. Nancy woke to the acrid smell of smoke seeping under her door. Her eyes flew open as shouts erupted from downstairs. The room was already filling with a gray haze that made her throat burn. "Fire!" Everyone out. Mrs. Taylor's voice carried up the stairs, tight with panic. Nancy scrambled from her bed, heart pounding. The floorboards felt warm beneath her feet as she grabbed her shawl. Her first thought was of the children, 3 orphans who stayed in the room next to hers. She rushed into the hallway, coughing as thicker smoke rolled up the stairs. "Sarah! Tommy! Beth!" she called out, dropping to her knees where the air was clearer. The sound of frightened crying led her to their room. The children huddled together near their window, wide-eyed with fear. Little Sarah clutched her Bible to her chest, her face streaked with tears. Nancy quickly gathered them close. "Cover your mouths with your nightshirts," she instructed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Stay low and follow me. Don't let go of each other's hands." The stairs creaked ominously as they descended, the smoke growing thicker with each step. Nancy could see orange flames licking up the walls of the kitchen below. The heat pressed against them like a physical force. Mrs. Taylor stood at the front door, ushering people out. "Hurry!" she called, extending her arms to receive the children as Nancy guided them forward. They burst out into the cold morning air, gasping and coughing. Nancy's lungs burned as she gulped in clean breaths. The snow beneath their feet quickly turned to slush as more townspeople rushed to help, forming a bucket line from the nearest pump. The fire bell began to toll, its iron voice echoing across the town. In his jail cell, Daniel jerked awake at the sound. His face was bruised from the previous night's arrest, but he forgot the pain as he heard the commotion outside. He moved to the barred window, straining to see through the frosted glass. The orange glow of flames reflected off the fresh snow, casting an unholy light across the street. Daniel recognized the location instantly, the boarding house where Nancy stayed. He yanked at his chains, the metal cutting into his wrists, but the bonds held fast. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Someone! There's people in there, but no one came to check on the prisoner, all hands needed at the fire." Outside, the gathered crowd watched helplessly as the flames consumed the wooden building. The bucket line proved futile against the intensity of the blaze. Timbers groaned and cracked, sending showers of sparks into the gray morning sky. Nancy stood wrapped in a borrowed blanket, the 3 children pressed against her sides. She watched in horror as the upper floor, where her room had been, collapsed inward with a thunderous crash. The deeds hidden in Sarah's Bible would be nothing but ashes now. At the edge of the crowd, a figure in a bowler hat observed the destruction with cold satisfaction. The railroad agent caught Nancy's eye and tipped his hat before turning away, his boots leaving precise tracks in the fresh snow. Nancy's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the slush. Everything was gone. The proof of the railroad's corruption, her few possessions, even the roof over her head. The children huddled closer, seeking comfort she wasn't sure she could give. Reverend Cole appeared through the crowd, his kind face etched with concern. He knelt beside Nancy, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The Lord provides, even in our darkest hours," he said softly. "Truth cannot be destroyed by fire, dear one. It lives in the hearts of those who know it." Nancy tried to find comfort in his words, but the weight of defeat pressed down on her like a physical thing. "The papers," she whispered. "They're gone. There's no way to prove what they did now." The Reverend helped her to her feet as the last walls of the boarding house fell. The crash sent up a cloud of embers that danced against the gray sky like fallen stars. Mrs. Taylor moved through the crowd, counting heads and checking on her displaced boarders. "Everyone's accounted for," she announced, her voice rough from smoke. "The Lord be praised for that much at least." As the fire began to die down, leaving only smoking ruins, the townspeople started to disperse. The morning chill crept back in, making the children shiver in their nightclothes. "Nancy?" A woman stepped forward, Martha Wilson, wife of one of the miners. "You and the little ones will come stay with us. We've plenty of room, and it's the Christian thing to do." Nancy nodded gratefully, too exhausted to speak. She gathered the children and followed Martha through the snowy streets to a small but well-kept house on the edge of town. That evening, Nancy sat in a borrowed nightgown beside the Wilsons' fireplace. The children slept deeply in the next room, worn out from the morning's terror. The flames in the hearth were warm and contained, so different from the destructive force that had devoured her home and hopes. She stared into the fire, remembering the railroad agent's satisfied smirk. There was no doubt in her mind that he had set the blaze, though she could never prove it, just as she could no longer prove any of the railroad's crimes. Martha Wilson brought her a cup of tea, the china worn but carefully tended. "You drink that down now," she insisted. "Nothing settles the nerves like a hot cup of tea." Nancy wrapped her cold fingers around the cup, but the warmth couldn't reach the chill in her heart. Her thoughts turned to Daniel, locked away in his cell. Had he heard the fire bell? Did he know she was safe? The memory of him defending her, taking a beating for her sake, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She thought of her late husband, of his deathbed confession and the papers he'd left behind. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his memory. "I tried to make it right." The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the simple room. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the scorched remains of the boarding house in a clean white blanket. Nancy sipped her tea and watched the flames, feeling more lost and alone than she had since first arriving in Clearwater. Yet even in her despair, she could hear the children's peaceful breathing from the next room, could feel the honest kindness of the Wilsons' hospitality. Perhaps Reverend Cole was right. Truth lived in people's hearts, not just in papers and deeds. But sitting there in borrowed clothes, watching another fire burn, Nancy couldn't see how truth alone would be enough to stop the railroad's iron march through their lives. The morning after the fire dawned cold and gray. Inside the jail cell, Daniel sat on his narrow cot, his bruised face throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The deputy's boots clicked against the wooden floor as he paced outside the cell. "Mighty convenient, ain't it?" Deputy Hayes drawled, pausing to peer through the bars. "You get locked up, then the widow's place burns down, almost like someone wanted to destroy evidence." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I was chained right here all night. You know that." "Maybe you had help," Hayes suggested, his voice dripping with false concern. "Someone to do your dirty work while you stayed safe in here, building your alibi." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Daniel turned away, knowing anything he said would only feed the deputy's lies. Through the barred window, he could see townspeople gathering in small clusters, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. Hayes left the jail, and soon his poisonous words spread through town like wildfire. McCrae was sweet on the widow, people murmured. When she spurned him, he got revenge. The story grew with each telling, painting Daniel as a jealous mountain man driven mad by rejection. At mid-morning, Reverend Cole arrived at the jail, his Bible tucked under one arm. The deputy blocked his path. "Come to minister to the arsonist, Reverend?" Hayes asked with a smirk. "I've come to request Daniel's release," Cole replied firmly. "There's not a shred of evidence against him, and you know it." "He assaulted me," Hayes said, touching the bruise on his jaw. "And now there's the matter of the fire." "He stays where he is." The Reverend's usually gentle face hardened. "This isn't justice, Deputy. It's persecution." "Careful, Reverend," Hayes warned. "Wouldn't want folks thinking you're taking sides against the law." Cole stood his ground. "I take the side of truth, Deputy, as should you," but Hayes would not be moved. After several more attempts, the Reverend was forced to leave without seeing Daniel. His boots crunched heavily in the snow as he walked away, prayer moving silently on his lips. Across town, in the Wilsons' modest home, Nancy worked alongside Martha Wilson in the kitchen. The familiar tasks of cooking helped quiet her troubled mind, though grief still sat heavy in her chest. "The beans need more salt," Martha suggested kindly, watching Nancy stir the pot hanging over the fire. Nancy nodded, adding a pinch. The warm kitchen filled with the homey smell of cornbread baking in the Dutch oven. Despite her losses, gratitude welled up in her heart for this family's generosity. "I'll never forget your kindness," Nancy said softly, kneading another batch of cornbread dough. Martha touched her shoulder. "The good book says to shelter the stranger. Besides, any one of us could be homeless tomorrow, the way things are going with that railroad." The afternoon passed slowly. Nancy helped with chores, trying to earn her keep. She hung laundry, swept floors, and mended clothes, all while worry for Daniel gnawed at her conscience. The story of his supposed guilt had reached even here. Martha's husband had brought it home from the silver mine. As evening approached, the children who had escaped the fire played quietly in the Wilsons' small parlor. Nancy watched them from the kitchen doorway, marveling at their resilience. Young Tommy Reed sat apart from the others, holding his Bible close and staring into the fire. The boy had been especially quiet since the blaze. Nancy had noticed him watching her with strange intensity throughout the day, but whenever she met his gaze, he quickly looked away. After supper, as Nancy helped clear the dishes, Tommy finally approached her. His small fingers clutched his Bible tightly. "Miss Nancy?" he whispered, shifting from foot to foot. "I got something to show you." "What is it, Tommy?" she asked, kneeling to his level. The boy glanced around furtively, then held out his Bible. I took it from your room, before the fire. I'm sorry for going in without asking, but..." Nancy's heart skipped a beat as she took the worn book. "You saved this from the fire?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "I heard the deputy and that man in the fancy hat talking yesterday. They said they'd destroy the papers you had. I knew you kept important things in Sarah's Bible, so I..." His voice trailed off. With trembling fingers, Nancy opened the Bible. There, pressed between the pages of Psalms, were the railroad deeds, safe and untouched. The proof she thought lost forever had been preserved through the courage of a child. Tears spilled down Nancy's cheeks as she pulled Tommy into a fierce embrace. The boy stiffened in surprise, then relaxed, patting her back awkwardly. "Thank you," she whispered against his hair. "Oh, thank you." Tommy pulled back, looking worried. "Are you crying because I did wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Nancy smiled through her tears. "I'm crying because God used you to save something very important, something that will help a lot of people." The boy's face brightened. "Really? Like David helping the Israelites?" "Just like that," Nancy assured him, smoothing his tousled hair. Moving to a quiet corner of the parlor, Nancy sank to her knees. The precious document still clutched in one hand, she bowed her head in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for showing me your providence through the innocent heart of a child. Thank you for preserving these papers, and for giving me strength to continue this fight." As she prayed, the weight of despair lifted from her shoulders. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she no longer felt alone. God had provided a miracle through Tommy's simple act of faith. Nancy carefully wrapped the deeds in a clean handkerchief and tucked them deep in her pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight her heart was full of renewed purpose. The truth had been preserved, waiting for the right moment to come to light. In the warm glow of the parlor fire, Tommy curled up with his Bible, a quiet smile on his face. Nancy watched him, marveling at how God could use the smallest and most unexpected vessels to carry out his will. Martha Wilson's voice called from the kitchen. "Nancy, could you help me with these dishes?" "Coming," Nancy replied, rising from her prayer. As she walked to the kitchen, her hand brushed against the precious bundle in her pocket. Each step felt lighter now, carried by the wings of hope. Morning sunlight sparkled on fresh snow as Nancy stood before her mirror, pinning her hair with trembling fingers. Through the window of the Wilsons' spare room, she watched townspeople hurrying through the cold, their breaths forming clouds in the crisp air. The weight of the decision she'd made during the night pressed heavy on her shoulders. Martha Wilson knocked softly on the door. "Breakfast is ready, dear." "Thank you," Nancy replied, smoothing her simple black dress. "I'll be right down." She lifted Tommy's Bible from the bedside table, feeling the precious documents within. Her fingers traced the worn leather cover, drawing strength from its familiar texture. After a quiet moment of prayer, she descended to join the family. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with coffee and frying bacon. Mr. Wilson looked up from his plate, noting the Bible in her hands. "Heading to morning service?" he asked kindly. Nancy shook her head. "No, sir. I have business at the jail first." Martha shot her husband a worried glance. "Nancy, perhaps you should wait." The deputy dash quote. "I can't wait any longer," Nancy said firmly. "Too many people have suffered while I kept silent." The Wilsons exchanged concerned looks but didn't argue. They'd seen enough of the deputy's behavior to understand. After a quick breakfast, Nancy wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped out into the cold morning. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way down the main street. Several townsfolk stopped to stare, but Nancy kept her eyes forward, clutching the Bible close. The jail stood at the end of the street, its windows gleaming with frost. Deputy Hayes sat at his desk when she entered, boots propped up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. His eyes narrowed at her appearance. "Well, if it ain't the grieving widow," he drawled. "Come to confess?" "I'm here to see Daniel," Nancy said steadily. Hayes made a show of considering. "Don't know if that's wise. Man's dangerous. Started that fire and all." "We both know that's a lie," Nancy replied, meeting his gaze. The deputy's jaw tightened, but he gestured toward the cells with his knife. 5 minutes. That's all." Nancy walked past him, her heart beating faster as she approached Daniel's cell. The mountain man stood as she neared, his face showing concern. "Nancy? What are you doing here?" She glanced back to ensure Hayes wasn't listening, then held up the Bible. "The documents survived," she whispered. "Tommy saved them from the fire." Daniel's eyes widened as she carefully showed him the papers through the bars. His weathered hands reached out to touch them briefly, then withdrew. "I'm going to present them to the town," Nancy continued softly. "Everyone needs to know the truth about what the railroad's been doing." "Nancy," Daniel's voice was rough with emotion, "they won't let you speak easy." "That agent, he's dangerous." "I know," she replied, "but I have to try. For everyone who's lost their land, their homes, for you." Daniel's eyes glistened in the dim light. Pride and fear warred in his expression as he studied her face through the iron bars. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known," he said quietly. Nancy felt warmth spread through her chest despite the jail's chill. "Will you pray for me?" "Every minute," Daniel promised. "God give you strength, Nancy, and me the patience to sit here while you face them." "Time's up," Hayes called from his desk. Nancy stepped back from the cell, holding Daniel's gaze for one more moment before turning away. As she passed the deputy's desk, she held her head high. The morning grew colder as Nancy walked back through town. She stopped at Reverend Cole's house, sharing her plan to reveal the documents at that evening's town meeting. The preacher listened gravely, then offered his support and prayers. Snow began falling again by afternoon, adding to the blanket of white covering Clearwater. Nancy spent the remaining daylight hours helping Martha prepare supper, all while rehearsing the words she would use that night. "The railroad claimed fair purchase," she practiced quietly while peeling potatoes. "But these deeds prove otherwise. They show how claims were stolen, how honest folk were cheated." Martha listened as she worked, offering suggestions to make the message clearer. "Speak plain," she advised. "Let the truth do its own work." The Wilson children played quietly in the corner, building a town from wooden blocks. Nancy watched them, thinking how their future might depend on what happened at the meeting. As evening approached, more snow fell steadily outside the windows. The family gathered around the table for what felt like a last supper of sorts. Nancy managed only a few bites of Martha's hearty stew, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. "Whatever happens," Mr. Wilson said as they finished eating, "you've shown real courage, Mrs. Hensley." "Thank you," Nancy replied softly. "For everything." Young Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Nancy? Will you read from the Bible before you go?" Nancy smiled, opening the precious book to Psalms. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" she read. "The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The words strengthened her resolve. After helping clear the dishes, she prepared to leave for the meeting. Martha pressed a warm shawl into her hands. "God go with you," the older woman whispered. Meanwhile, in his cold cell, Daniel knelt in prayer. The jail had grown quiet, with even Hayes leaving to attend the meeting. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows on the floor. "Lord," Daniel prayed, his rough voice barely a whisper, "protect her. Give her the words she needs, and help me trust in your timing, even from behind these bars." He thought of Nancy's face that morning, how determination had burned in her eyes despite her fear. His heart swelled with pride even as worry gnawed at him. He knew the railroad agent would be at the meeting, knew the man's reputation for dealing harshly with threats to his employer's interests. The sound of boots crunching in snow drew his attention to the window. Townspeople were heading toward the meeting hall, their shapes dark against the white ground. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cold bars. "Be with her, Lord," he whispered. "Be with her." Snow continued to fall, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the sounds of the gathering town. In the growing darkness, Clearwater seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever the night would bring. Back at the Wilsons' home, Nancy stood before the mirror one last time. She tucked a stray strand of hair beneath her bonnet and straightened her shawl. The Bible felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the truth it contained. Martha appeared in the doorway. "It's time." Nancy nodded, drawing a deep breath. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's time." Together they stepped out into the snowy evening, their boots leaving tracks in the fresh powder. The street was quiet now, most folks already gathered at the meeting hall. Nancy's heart thundered in her chest, but her steps remained steady. The truth had waited long enough. Tonight, it would finally come to light. The church bell's deep tone echoed through Clearwater as dawn broke over the snow-covered peaks. Its steady rhythm called the townspeople from their homes and businesses, drawing them toward the white-painted building that stood as the heart of their community. Reverend Cole had posted notice of the meeting the previous evening, and now he stood at the church steps, greeting each arrival with a solemn nod. The morning air was crisp and clear, steam rising from the breaths of bundled townspeople as they climbed the steps. Inside the Wilson home, Nancy smoothed her dress with trembling hands. Martha helped her pin her hair neatly beneath her bonnet, their eyes meeting in the mirror. "The Lord goes before you," Martha said softly, squeezing Nancy's shoulder. Nancy clutched the Bible to her chest, feeling the weight of the documents inside. "I pray he gives me the words." The walk to the church seemed both endless and too short. Nancy's boots crunched through fresh snow, leaving a solitary trail down the middle of the empty street. She could see people filing into the church ahead, their voices carrying on the morning air. At the steps, Reverend Cole took her elbow gently. "Are you ready, my dear?" Nancy drew a deep breath and nodded. "With God's help." They entered together, the familiar scent of wood polish and lamp oil washing over them. The pews were nearly full. Weather-worn miners sat shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers and ranchers. Children fidgeted in Sunday best, watched closely by mothers who whispered reminders to sit still. Deputy Hayes stood at the back, arms crossed over his chest, his badge catching the light from the windows. His eyes followed Nancy's progress down the aisle, dark with suspicion. Nancy's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked past familiar faces. Some offered encouraging smiles, while others turned away. She glimpsed young Tommy sitting with the Wilsons, his small face beaming with pride at the Bible he had saved. The wooden steps to the pulpit creaked beneath her feet. Nancy placed the Bible carefully on the smooth surface, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. Reverend Cole stood nearby, his presence steadying. "Friends and neighbors," the preacher began, his voice filling the hushed space, "we are gathered this morning to hear truth that has too long been hidden. Mrs. Hensley has come forward with evidence concerning matters that affect us all." Nancy opened the Bible with care, removing the folded papers within. Her hands shook slightly as she spread them across the pulpit, but her voice carried clear and strong when she spoke. "These are land deeds," she said, meeting the eyes of those nearest. "They show how the railroad company acquired properties in and around Clearwater." She paused, gathering courage. "They prove that honest families were cheated out of their claims." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Nancy held up one document, its official seal visible to all. "This deed bears 2 dates," she continued. "The first shows when Mr. Peterson's land was legally registered. The second, written over it, claims the railroad purchased it 3 months earlier, before Mr. Peterson even arrived in Colorado territory." Gasps echoed from the pews. Old Pete Peterson himself stood up, his weathered face red with anger. "I knew it! Them papers they showed me was forged." "That's a serious accusation," Deputy Hayes called from the back, his voice cutting through the growing noise. "Mrs. Hensley is spinning tales, trying to smear honest business dealings with lies." "They are not lies," Nancy replied firmly. She held up another document. "Here's proof that the Wilson's Creek claim was registered to another name, while Mr. Wilson lay sick with fever. And the Baxter farm—" "She's a liar!" Hayes pushed away from the wall, stalking down the aisle. "Those papers are stolen property, if they exist at all." Reverend Cole stepped forward, his gentle face stern. "I have examined these documents myself, Deputy. They bear official seals and signatures. Their authenticity is clear." "As is their message," Nancy added, her voice growing stronger. "The railroad has been stealing land through fraud and intimidation. My husband," her voice caught for a moment, "my husband helped them do it. He kept these records out of guilt, hoping someday to make things right. The church door burst open with a bang that made several people cry out. The railroad agent strode in, snow falling from his bowler hat, his pistol drawn and glinting. "That's quite enough, Mrs. Hensley," he said coldly. "Those papers were stolen from railroad offices. I'm here to collect them. And you—" Fear rippled through the congregation. Several people ducked down in their pews. Nancy's heart pounded, but she stood straight, one hand resting on the Bible. "These documents belong to the people of Clearwater," she said clearly. "They prove how you've wronged them. I won't be silent anymore." "You'll be silent enough in prison," the agent snarled, taking another step forward. "Deputy, arrest her." Hayes moved toward the pulpit, but Reverend Cole stepped between them. "This is God's house," he declared firmly. "You'll not bring violence here." "Stand aside, preacher," the agent warned, raising his pistol. "This doesn't concern you." Nancy's voice rang out, steady and clear despite her racing heart. "I am not afraid of your threats," she declared. "I trust in God's justice, not man's corruption. These people deserve to know the truth." The agent's face twisted with rage. "Truth?" "The truth is you're nothing but a troublemaking widow who should have kept her mouth shut. Now." "Now you'll lower that weapon," came a new voice from the doorway. The sheriff stood there, several deputies behind him, all with rifles trained on the agent. "And you'll surrender nice and peaceful-like in the Lord's house." The agent's eyes darted around the church, seeing only hostile faces. Slowly, he lowered his pistol. "Deputy Hayes," the sheriff continued, "you might want to join your friend here. We've got some questions about your involvement in these land deals." Hayes backed away from the pulpit, his face pale. Two deputies moved to flank him and the agent, leading them both outside. In the silence that followed, Nancy's hands trembled as she gathered the documents. "These deeds," she said softly, "belong to you all. With God as my witness, I'll help make this right." The quiet broke as people began standing, moving forward to examine the papers, calling out names and dates they recognized. Reverend Cole raised his hands for quiet. "The Lord tells us the truth shall set us free," he proclaimed. "Today, thanks to Mrs. Hensley's courage, truth has come to light in Clearwater." Nancy stood at the pulpit, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks as she watched families embrace, minors clap each other's shoulders, and children hop excitedly in the aisles. Young Tommy ran up to hug her skirts. "You did it, Miss Nancy," he exclaimed. "You told the truth just like my mama always said to." Nancy knelt and hugged him tight, her heart full of gratitude, for this child's innocent faith that had saved the documents, for the strength God had given her to speak, and for the justice that had finally come to light in this small mountain town. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, touching everything with gold, as if heaven itself was smiling down on Clearwater's redemption. The tension in the church snapped like a dry twig. Deputy Hayes lunged forward, his boots thundering on the wooden floor as he made a desperate grab for the papers on the pulpit. Nancy clutched them to her chest, stumbling backward, but she needn't have worried. 3 burly miners stepped into Hayes's path, their weathered faces set with determination. "That's far enough, Deputy," growled Pete Peterson, planting his feet wide. The railroad agent raised his pistol higher, his knuckles white around the grip. "Stand back, or I'll—" Before he could finish, Reverend Cole moved with surprising speed for a man of God. He grabbed the agent's wrist, forcing it upward just as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked through the church like thunder, sending splinters raining from the rafters. Women screamed, and children ducked under the pews. "The Lord's house will not be defiled by violence," Reverend Cole declared, wrestling with the agent for control of the weapon. The church doors burst open as townsfolk who had been passing by rushed in at the sound of gunfire. The morning light streamed in behind them, silhouetting their figures in the doorway. Nancy watched as the 2 men grappled, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she called out, "Help him!" Several men surged forward to aid the preacher. In the chaos, the pistol clattered to the floor, spinning across the wooden planks. A miner's boot stopped its slide. "Daniel McCrae is innocent!" Nancy's voice rang clear above the commotion. She held the documents high, letting everyone see them. "These papers prove the railroad's crimes and the deputy's part in them. Daniel tried to protect me, to protect the truth. He doesn't belong in that jail." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. More people were pushing into the church now, drawn by the noise and confusion. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes stirred up by the scuffle. "Release McCrae!" someone shouted from the back. "Aye! Free him!" Another voice joined in. The cry was taken up by others, growing louder with each repetition. "Free McCrae! Free McCrae!" Deputy Hayes's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between the angry faces surrounding him. The railroad agent backed toward the door, his previously confident demeanor crumbling in the face of the town's united front. "This isn't over," Hayes snarled, but his voice shook. He grabbed the agent's arm. "Come on!" The two men fled through the church doors, shoving past the gathering crowd. Their rapid footsteps could be heard pounding down the wooden sidewalk, fading into the distance. A cheer went up inside the church. Reverend Cole, straightening his collar with dignified calm, accepted the fallen pistol from the miner who had retrieved it. "I believe," he said clearly, "these documents would be safest in my keeping for now." He extended his hand to Nancy, who carefully passed him the papers. "Thank you," she whispered, her legs suddenly weak with relief. The Reverend addressed the congregation, which had swelled to fill every corner of the church. "Friends, what we have witnessed today is both an ending and a beginning. The truth about the railroad's dealings has finally come to light." "Spread the word," called out Mrs. Wilson from her pew. "Let everyone know what they did to us." The news rippled outward like waves in a pond. People began hurrying from the church, eager to share what they had seen and heard. Nancy could hear their voices carrying on the morning air, spreading the story of the railroad's fraud and the proof that had finally emerged. Some stayed behind, gathering around Nancy with words of support and apology for their previous suspicions. Tommy, the young orphan boy, wormed his way through the crowd to stand beside her, beaming with pride at the role his saved Bible had played. "You were so brave, Miss Nancy," he said, slipping his small hand into hers. Hours later, as the winter sun settled toward the mountains, Nancy sat in the Wilsons' parlor, warming herself by their crackling fire. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was too full for rest. The events of the morning played over and over in her thoughts: the confrontation, the gunshot, the deputy's flight, the town's sudden shift from suspicion to support. Mrs. Wilson pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. "Drink this, dear. You've had quite a day." "I keep thinking of Daniel," Nancy admitted, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "He's still in that jail, not knowing what happened." "The sheriff will sort it out," Mr. Wilson assured her from his chair by the fire. "Word's spreading fast about them papers. Won't be long before the whole territory knows what the railroad's been up to." "I pray you're right." Nancy sipped her tea, watching the flames dance. The warmth of the fire and the kindness of this family who had taken her in touched her deeply. Yet she couldn't fully relax knowing Daniel remained behind bars. A soft knock at the door made them all look up. Mrs. Wilson opened it to find Reverend Cole standing there, snow dusting his shoulders. "Good evening," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "I thought you'd want to know. I've locked the documents in the church safe. 2 men are standing guard tonight, just to be certain." Nancy nodded gratefully. "What about the deputy and the agent?" "Fled town, from what I hear. Took the afternoon stage heading east." The Reverend's eyes twinkled. "Rather hastily, I'm told." "Good riddance," Mr. Wilson muttered. "And Daniel?" Nancy couldn't keep the question back any longer. Reverend Cole's face grew serious. "Still waiting." The sheriff wants to follow proper procedures, ensure everything's done legally. But don't worry. He'll hear about today's events soon enough." Nancy set down her teacup, fighting back tears of frustration. After everything that had happened, after the truth had finally come out, Daniel was still sitting alone in that cold cell. "He was the first one to stand up for me," she said softly, "when everyone else believed the worst." Mrs. Wilson sat beside her, patting her hand. "And tomorrow's another day, dear. The Lord works in His own time." Outside, snow began to fall again, adding to the blanket of white that covered Clearwater's streets. In his cell, Daniel McCrae waited in the darkness, unaware that the tide had finally turned, that Nancy's courage and truth had prevailed, that the town had rallied to their cause, that justice was at last finding its way to this small corner of Colorado territory. The fire crackled softly as Nancy closed her eyes in prayer, thankful for the day's victories, yet anxious for what tomorrow might bring. In the warmth of the Wilsons' parlor, surrounded by their kindness, she felt both deeply weary and quietly hopeful. The truth had come to light, and with it, the promise of redemption, not just for her, but for all of Clearwater. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater's snow-covered main street. A crowd had gathered outside the jail, their breath visible in the crisp winter air. Reverend Cole stood at the front, his Bible tucked under one arm, while Nancy waited nervously among the townsfolk. "Open up," called Mr. Wilson, rapping his knuckles against the jail's wooden door. "We're here for Daniel McCrae." The door creaked open, revealing the night deputy, a young man who looked relieved to see Reverend Cole among the gathering. "I heard about what happened at the church yesterday," he said, fingers fumbling with his ring of keys. "Been waiting for someone to come with proper authority." "The deeds have been sent by telegraph to Judge Harrison in Denver," Reverend Cole announced, his voice carrying to the crowd. "The railroad's fraud will face the law's full scrutiny." The night deputy nodded, stepping aside. "Reckon that's authority enough for me." The cell door squealed on its hinges. Daniel McCrae emerged slowly, squinting in the bright morning light that streamed through the jail's small windows. His beard had grown rougher during his confinement, and his clothes were wrinkled, but his eyes were clear and steady. Nancy stepped forward from the crowd, her heart beating faster. "Welcome back," she said softly. Daniel's weather-worn face softened at the sight of her. "Much obliged for not giving up on me." Together, they walked out into the morning sunshine. The crowd parted respectfully, and as Daniel and Nancy made their way down the main street, men removed their hats, and women nodded in greeting. The same townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid Nancy now smiled warmly. "Look there," Daniel murmured, gesturing to the stage depot. "Empty. Seems our deputy and his railroad friend didn't waste any time leaving town." "Good riddance," someone in the crowd called out, drawing scattered chuckles. As the day progressed, word spread that there would be a gathering at the church that evening. What started as a small Thanksgiving service grew into something more. Lanterns were strung between the porch posts, their golden light reflecting off the fresh snow. The smell of coffee and pine boughs filled the air as people arrived carrying dishes of food and warm quilts to ward off the evening chill. Inside the church, Daniel found himself surrounded by miners and shopkeepers who wanted to shake his hand and apologize for believing the worst. He accepted their words awkwardly, unused to such attention after his years of solitude. Nancy watched from near the punch bowl, smiling at his discomfort. When the crowd finally thinned, Daniel made his way to her side. "Might we step outside for a moment?" he asked quietly. The church porch was peaceful compared to the cheerful noise within. Their boots crunched in the fresh snow as they stood looking out at the starlit town. "I need to thank you proper," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "What you did, standing up to them like that, it took real courage." Nancy shook her head. "I was terrified the whole time." "That's what makes it brave." Daniel turned to face her, his expression earnest in the lantern light. Truth is, I'd about given up on everything before coming to Clearwater. Thought God had forgotten me up there in the mountains. He paused, clearing his throat. Then you went and kissed me that Sunday, and something changed. Like a spark catching in dry timber. I felt it too, Nancy admitted softly. When everyone looked at me with suspicion, you stood up. It gave me hope when I needed it most. From inside the church came the sound of voices raised in song. Amazing Grace floated out into the winter night, accompanied by someone's fiddle. Listen to that, Daniel said, a smile tugging at his mouth. Whole town singing together, railroad man's widow and mountain hermit standing peaceful on the church steps. Reckon God has a sense of humor after all. Nancy laughed softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Maybe he just knows what we need better than we do. The hymn swelled as more voices joined in, filling the night with its message of redemption. Through the church windows, they could see families gathered close, children drowsing on parents' laps, old rivalries forgotten in the warmth of shared celebration. Clearwater feels different tonight, Nancy observed, like we've all finally found our way home. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their breath mingle in the cold air, while inside the church, the community they had helped heal raised their voices in joyful praise. Sunday morning painted Clearwater in crystal brilliance. Fresh snow blanketed the ground, untouched except for the neat paths townsfolk had swept between buildings. The church bell's clear tone rang across the valley, calling everyone to worship. Daniel McCrae stood at the bottom of the church steps, his boots freshly polished and his best shirt pressed smooth. Though he had faced down mountain lions without flinching, his hands trembled slightly as he watched Nancy approach. She wore a blue dress that matched the winter sky, her cheeks pink from the cold morning air. Mighty fine morning, Daniel managed, his voice gruff with nervousness. Nancy smiled, taking in his unusually tidy appearance. Indeed it is. Together they stood beside the church steps, greeting people as they filed past. Children scampered by, their Sunday shoes clicking on the wooden steps. Miners who had once scorned Nancy now tipped their hats respectfully. The whole town seemed lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. The second bell began to ring, its melody floating across the snow-covered rooftops. Daniel turned to Nancy, his weather-worn face serious. His voice carried clearly in the crisp air as he repeated the words that had changed everything. I'd give everything I own for one kiss. This time there was no shock, no scandal in his declaration. Nancy's eyes sparkled as she stepped closer, her smile warm and sure. Instead of the gentle peck on the cheek she had given that first Sunday, she reached up and pressed her lips tenderly to his. The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise. The remaining townsfolk on the steps burst into cheers and applause. Several of the children giggled and covered their eyes. Even old Walter at the back of the crowd was grinning beneath his mustache. Reverend Cole appeared in the doorway, beaming at the scene before him. He raised his hands for quiet, and the crowd settled. Let us pray, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered congregation. Lord, we thank you for this morning's blessing, for healing old wounds and bringing new joy to Clearwater, for showing us that truth and love can overcome any darkness. Amen. Amen, the crowd echoed warmly. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Daniel and Nancy walked hand in hand down the snowy main street. Lamplight spilled from shop windows, turning the fresh snow to gold. They passed the site where the boarding house had burned, now cleared and ready for new beginnings. I've been thinking, Daniel said, squeezing Nancy's hand. That plot of land near the creek, it would make a fine place for a house, room enough for a garden, maybe even some youngsters to help tend it. Nancy's eyes grew soft. You mean the orphans? Daniel nodded. Reckon they need a proper home as much as we do. Tommy's already taken to following me around, asking about trap lines and such. A real family, Nancy whispered, her voice full of wonder. Daniel McCrae, who would have thought that morning in church would lead to this? The lights of Clearwater glowed warm and welcoming in every window, no longer divided by suspicion and secrets. The town had found its way back to truth, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.